Hello world, this is Gus again. I was just thinking how wonderful my community was where I grew up. Back in New Jersey, in Audubon, New Jersey, I grew up at 215 South Lacato Avenue. And the community was so good to me that I owe a lot to them of how I've turned out today. See, I didn't have a very nurturing family. My father had already walked out on us when I was 3 or 4. So I grew up there in Audubon with my grandparents, my mother, and my sister, with a whole sundry of aunts and uncles spread around town. But the biggest thing that I got positively from my upbringing was the learning that it does take a community to raise a child. And I have kind of spent my life trying to reinvent what I went through there. And I've been very unsuccessful at it. But what I realize now is we live in a different time. Those were days. I was just thinking this morning how on my particular street, I knew every person on that street, the adults and of course the children alike. If they were children, I spent time in every one of their houses at some point playing games or whatever. But even the adults, it was the same thing. I knew and could go into every house in that neighborhood, because just like I am now, I've always been a person of the streets, and that's where I got it from. Going door to door, looking for a cookie, looking for a talk. I knew the adults. I knew their stories. I knew their likes and their dislikes, and I think I've always kept that with me. But I can only think of 2 houses that never happened at, and that's immaterial. 2 houses out of my whole street. And that was part of my upbringing. These were days, of course, when you didn't have to lock your doors. It was a safe time. A child could go door to door without any problems. Nobody inspected our Halloween bags after Halloween. It was just the way it was, and there was no thought process to anything really, nothing negative. There was no negativity. With one caveat, I remember this really great neighbors moved in next door to us, Mary and Pat Capaccio. They were good old Italian people from Philadelphia, and we all got along famously. And at one point, though, for maybe a year or so, Mary wanted nothing to do with us kids, and we were, of course, as kids were, we were going to battle right back with her. Get off my lawn, don't bother me, blah, blah, blah. And it was really terrible. And we didn't know what happened until years later. I realized, as an adult, Mary, she got through this thing, but she was going through change of life. And back then, there was nothing to help these poor women. And so they acted out. So that was just a very temporary thing. That's the worst thing that I can ever remember happening in my neighborhood. And then for me, the rest of the community, my Boy Scouts, my church, Little League, school, where I will admit I was one of the worst students around and probably got in the most trouble in school all the way until I was expelled in the 9th grade. But even the teachers, Mrs. Pierce, who's now Mrs. Hull, my 9th grade science teacher, I've stayed in contact with her my whole life. My principal, who booted me out, I've been in contact with him until up around a year ago. I'm calling from time to time. We've had very good bonds over those years because I became the person that they would wanted me to come, and I've picked up the good virtues of life and passed them on to other children. Plus, as Mrs. Hall always says to me now, she liked my spirit, and and I guess continues to, since I just sent her an email and she calls me my hero. And I think those things are wonderful. But it took a community to raise me because, like I said, I didn't have the nurturing at home, but I got it from the community. I watched how those parents treated their children and how they treated me, and the church, how the pastor came to my aid for my family problems many, many times. How my friends later on would tell me in my life, well, I'll back up a second, my life was going to change immensely when I was 8. My mother was going to remarry. Met a great guy, Joe Stroop, Cleveland, Ohio. A month before the wedding, a month before the wedding, Joe was killed in a car wreck. Devastated me. Still did, because it changed my life completely. But I learned you don't look back, you can't change anything. But that aside, later in later years, my friends, Bobby Coward actually, took me aside and says, Gus, we felt so bad for you then, because we know what that meant to you. And I really appreciate those thoughts. So I thank you, community, for the yous that have gone on. I thank you for helping make me the person I am today. And of course, again, a special thanks to Mr. Cowan. He was my assistant scoutmaster along with Mr. Vanderslice. He died before I could ever go back and see him again, but Mr. Cowan grew up with his son Cliff. Bobby lived across the street. Just a good nucleus of kids and all that. All of my classmates and my Boy Scout mates all went on to very successful careers, and I'm really happy for all of them. But Mr. Cowan, I saw Mr. Cowan last in 1995 when I made one of my few trips back to my hometown. And I says, Mr. Cowan, I really want to thank you for the time you spent with us boys growing up, and the stories you would tell, and at Boy Scout camp and scare us and all that. I really appreciate that. Well, Mr. Cowan stood there and cried. And he says, Gus, thank you for very much for validating my life. And someday I hope that a child will, as an adult, will stand in front of me and do the same thing. Bye now.